From Animal Crossing to Super Mario Bros. And back to Pokemon again, Nintendo has had varying degrees of success when it has come to anime projects based on their video game franchises. Some of these would be massively successful, some of these would become hidden gems, and others would be mostly forgotten. So let's go ahead and look at every anime project that Nintendo has ever made. Now for this video, we're only going to be talking about the anime projects in the traditional anime sense, not like the weird cartoons that were like third-party made or the weird CDI games that existed. We're talking like dedicated anime type series or movie, because there's already a ton of things that we need to cover here. So to start things off, let's go all the way back to 1986 with Super Mario Bros. The Great Mission to Rescue Princess Peach. Oh boy, where do we even begin with this? For context, this movie released just a single year after Super Mario Bros. Originally released for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, of course, Mario and Luigi already had some popularity before the game came out from like arcade machines, like the Mario Bros. Game. But obviously, the NES took things to a whole nother level, so why not capitalize on that? Now, in this movie that was limitedly released in Japan theaters and later brought to VHS and Betamax, we get to see Mario playing on his Famicom, and one night he has to help some woman who jumps out of his television screen who says that her name is Princess Peach. Bowser or King Koopa appears or something. Then that didn't go very well. Then there's this weird subplot that's kind of like Cinderella where Mario finds Peach's necklace. And things get really weird in this one, like Mario and Luigi work at a grocery store on their off days, I guess. A lot of stuff happens. All of a sudden, Mario and Luigi fall down a pipe and they're transported into the video game world, and they have to go and save Peach before she's forced to marry King Koopa. A ton of stuff is standing in their way, but ultimately they do end up making it to save the day. But then it also turns out that Princess Peach already has like a regular fiance who like thanks them, and Mario's disappointed that he doesn't get the girl at the end, and that's just how this story like wraps up. And I'll be honest, for a video game adaptation into an anime, this is kind of unique and interesting. I don't necessarily think the plot or the story is like a piece of literary genius by any means, but for something that came out in the 80s and its art style, it was kind of fun to take a look at. There is a pretty big cult following around this series, which is pretty cool, but it's nowhere near the coolest thing that Nintendo's ever worked on. Now, following this anime adaptation, there wouldn't be too much in the forms of traditional anime projects for Nintendo series until probably one of the biggest and most successful ones, Pokemon in 1997. Now, I really don't need to detail this one so much. So many people understand what Pokemon is and what the TV show has been like. It's been on the air for like 25 seasons. There have been a ton of spin-offs over the years. The main story obviously follows like loosely the plot of the video games to an extent, sometimes more loosely than others. But nonetheless, it served as not only a pretty solid anime overall, especially in the very beginning, but it also served as a huge piece of growing out the Pokemon universe and the world building, especially in a time where like the main way you would experience Pokemon was just through a Game Boy that had limited graphics. The anime built up this bigger world that allowed for kids' imagination to kind of run wild in their own game even. They could really imagine that these battles were like what the battles you would see in the television show. Now, the main series of the Pokemon television series that started all the way in Japan in 1997 has followed Ash Ketchum, and that is actually now officially coming to an end, and they're going to start a brand new series following new protagonists. But I think the staying power of the original run of the show is incredible, and it's a testament to the lasting power that something like this that's done very well, it shows how long it can go. I mean, in Japan alone, they even had shows about the show that would play after the anime episodes aired, like live action stuff. It's really, really cool. I'm still a huge fan of Pokemon to this day, and hopefully there's more interesting projects that release in the future. In 2006, we got a very special and almost unexpected project that released following Animal Crossing Wild World's release on the Nintendo DS in the form of a film called Geki Jouban Dobutsu no Mori, and I probably pronounced that incorrectly. But yeah, it was an Animal Crossing standalone anime film that was 87 minutes long and really tried to paint a very unique story in the Animal Crossing universe in that traditional anime art style. Now, this movie follows a protagonist girl named Ai who moves into this animal village during the summertime and meets a ton of the villagers, has to be put to work by Tom Nook, very much so inspired by the video games themselves. There's some twists and turns as this overall story travels through multiple different seasons, but there's this little subplot where Ai ends up being depressed after realizing she missed a goodbye party for one of her villagers, and now the villager is gone, so she has to go cry in the cafe. It feels very reminiscent to experiences that I personally had in the real Animal Crossing games, sort of. Then there's this whole interesting plot line that happens in the second half where they find a crashed UFO, and then Gulliver's there, which is something that happens in Animal Crossing Wild World. They have to help him figure out where he's from and what to do, and obviously it's just Gulliver. But then real UFOs show up, and that's not expected at all. And everyone's like, oh, that was cool. And then they just kind of go back to their winter festival that they were doing, and things kind of wrap up. For the first time, the main character feels like a true member of the village, after kind of feeling like a bad neighbor and an outsider through most of the film. Unfortunately, this one never actually made a release into North America or in English versions. There's some fan dubs that are out there. And I'll be honest, as a big Animal Crossing fan, this is pretty fun to watch just for the illustrations and the art style and the very much so inspired Animal Crossing world that's built into it. The plot doesn't really seem to go anywhere, so it's more just like watching Animal Crossing visuals for me. I really think that they should bring this idea back though and try to do something again. It apparently did pretty well in the Japanese box office. There's a ton of Easter eggs of various Animal Crossing characters and villagers that also show up in the background even if they don't have the biggest role, which is really cool. But yeah, there were some interesting things that I thought were a little weird, like the fact that Ai, the main character, is only 11 years old and she's just moving to some random village and gets her own house and has to work a job and pay a mortgage. In my head, I mean, I never really put thought into how old our Animal Crossing villager was, but I always assumed like, I don't know, like adult age, enough to fend for themselves or sink or swim on their own. 11 definitely seems a little too young, which I thought was a weird aspect of this story. But nonetheless, if you're a huge Animal Crossing fan, it's definitely worth a watch. It's not the longest thing in the world anyways, and you probably will enjoy it. This next one's kind of interesting because in 2001 all the way through 2006 in some cases, Kirby got his own animated series called Kirby Right Back At Ya. It aired for 4 seasons, really ending around 2003, but in some places those episodes didn't finish airing until all the way out into 2006. This series was actually supervised by Masahiro Sakurai himself. It was really interesting. This show had this weird balance of being this like lighthearted, funny animated series, and then it would shift into like this superhero series in kind of the last act, and Kirby would go and save the day and have some interesting abilities, much like from the video games themselves. What is really interesting about this one though is towards the last season of this series, things kind of became more narrative driven and more connected through the episodes leading up until this final ultimate showdown, which was kind of cool. And this definitely became a major stepping point for the Kirby franchise overall. Some episodes were even included later on in 2012 Kirby's Dream Collection for the Wii, and more recently, like a week ago, Japan released a Blu-ray disc collection of the entire series, which is kind of a big deal. So yeah, this thing didn't last forever, but it definitely did have a lasting impact long term. Then there were some other shows that Nintendo worked on that weren't necessarily as successful adaptations from their video games. Like F-Zero GP Legend had a limited 1-season run of this animated series from all the way back in 2003. This was just 51 episodes of an interesting story that was not connected to the main story in any means whatsoever. It was its own continuity, and it was kind of like a fresh boot of the franchise. They took a lot of inspiration from the games, but then they had to take like this racing game franchise and try to like expand the lore into a long ongoing anime. It was cool in the fact that some characters would appear, like Captain Falcon, who was really most recognized from Super Smash Bros. And otherwise was just a racer in F-Zero, the main racer, but still a racer. in general, the F-Zero games didn't necessarily do as much in bringing this character to the forefront of like narrative storytelling, so it was kind of a weird adaptation when it came to the anime side, and I think that that might be a contributing factor as to why this never got picked up for any further seasons. Still, 51 episodes is pretty impressive. It just didn't quite have the lasting power to stick around for 20 plus years like something like Pokemon was able to do. Now, as far as series go themselves, there hasn't been too much as far as a continued series with new episodes and whatnot in the same manner of maybe what Pokemon has been able to do, but there has been some interesting things that have come out in order to try to promote some other products that are going out along the same time. Like, for instance, Star Fox Zero, which came out in 2016 on the Wii U. It didn't actually sell all that well, but it probably is a contributing factor to the Wii U's lack of performance, and then also the gameplay was a little wonky with the 2 controller setup. But one thing they did do to try to promote this game some more was launch this little miniature anime series based on Star Fox, which actually was really cool. As a long-term Star Fox fan, it was really interesting to see these characters return in a completely different way of storytelling. When I was a younger kid, not only did I grow up with Star Fox 64, but I also was really excited when games like Star Fox Adventures came out and Star Fox Assault, and those games did a lot in the narrative storytelling, kind of taking inspiration from other types of storytelling sources, but they put a story together and it was really fun to follow. So it was cool years later to see them try a different form of storytelling. Star Fox Zero itself didn't have that deep of a story, but at least with Star Fox Zero's anime promotional thing that they put out right before the game came out, it was a pretty cool way of kind of setting up the world, since it was essentially a reboot to the Star Fox series. Depending on where you watched it, you could have watched it cut up in parts on like your Wii U or 3DS, or you could watch the entire thing when it came out on YouTube, and it ended up being like a 15-minute long episode of just a single short film, I guess. But ultimately, it was a pretty cool adaptation, and it did get you a little bit excited about Star Fox Zero. I remember buying Star Fox Zero after watching this, and I played the game for like a whole day, and that was about it. Also, there were some other interesting promotional things Nintendo did to plug some other games. Of course, there was the obvious ones like with Pokemon, where they did like the whole mystery dungeon side thing, where they kind of did a little miniature story in one of the episodes to get people hyped for that. There was this really interesting short for Super Smash Bros. 4, where we got to see Link versus Pit in an anime style. It wasn't the longest thing in the world, but it was very impressive, and I think it showed the demand that fans have for something crazy like this to be done in a full form. And there's hope that in the future one day we might actually get to see something like a full-on Legend of Zelda anime in this style. Nintendo recently actually acquired an animation studio, and they haven't announced any projects yet, but there is the possibility that maybe all these projects that they've worked on over the years has kind of led them to a conclusion that, hey, we can make stuff and people will really like it, and it can grow our intellectual properties and be used to promote stuff as well. But yeah, this animation was really awesome too. Nintendo did the same thing with Kid Icarus, but I think they released this stuff exclusively on the 3DS, so not too many people really realized that this existed, but it was like a miniature anime series with multiple parts. Once again, like the Star Fox one, split up into short parts, but you could watch it all together for a little bit of a longer episode, and it promoted Kid Icarus Uprising, which came out on the 3DS, and that was a game from all the way back then, but I think that game probably came out right before the 3DS started to really pick up in sales, so not too many people actually experienced that game or even knew that this anime existed. But the anime short is pretty cool, especially since Kid Icarus, outside of appearing in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, hadn't really been a game series since all the way back in the NES days, so it kind of did a little bit of world building, much like what we mentioned Pokemon TV series was able to do, and I think it got people prepared for that game, and it was actually a really cool adaptation. Way back when, Pikmin actually had a very short animated thing done specifically for the game, but also later on they would come back and do some 3D animation, which isn't really an anime, but just worth mentioning here. And also another interesting short example is Wario Land Shake It had this little animated thing prepared specifically for that game as well. So this is something that has been kind of tested around in different capacities to really figure out what is the best way to maybe promote some games. If Nintendo needs to come in with a new marketing push, hey, they can throw some anime in there, and fans usually eat that stuff up. Okay, let's talk about Fire Emblem for a second, because this one is completely unique than anything that we've talked about in this video. Now, Fire Emblem actually had a 2-episode anime created in Japan all the way back in 1996. Now, the interesting thing about this is this possibly was maybe a pilot for a proposed show based on Fire Emblem that maybe never really got off the ground outside of these first 2 episodes airing. That's just speculation, just because of the way that this was released. But the really interesting thing is this was actually dubbed and subtitled and then released in North American formats on VHS just a year later in 1997. This actually is the first time that Fire Emblem would ever see a release outside of Japan in like the West. Fire Emblem wouldn't even make an appearance in any like Nintendo media or in like homes in the West officially in a video game until Super Smash Bros. Melee, which, as many of you remember, when Melee released, nobody knew who these characters were because there hadn't been any Fire Emblem games out here just yet. So unless you knew this obscure VHS release anime and knew who the characters were, or you were from Japan and familiar with the Japanese games, you probably didn't know who these characters were back when they appeared in Super Smash Bros. Melee. The one really interesting thing is that the original Japanese voice actor for the character Marth would later go on to voice the character again in Super Smash Bros. Melee, and then every time this character has appeared in a video game with voice acting, the actor Hikaru Midorikawa would come back and voice the character again. There's also other actors who appeared in this anime that later would come back and voice other characters in other Fire Emblem related projects. So this is really niche and obscure, but incredibly cool at the same time. More recently, the Fire Emblem series has really leaned into the anime style more recently, so they've also done some interesting other things with this anime design that might not be like in the traditional anime series-esque type thing. They did this interesting music video, which had some motion capture stuff just to promote the game. It had nothing to do with the game, but it was to promote Fire Emblem Heroes, and it just looked really, really cool. Okay, then there's some other really interesting projects that kind of got put into works much later on. Like, for instance, there's an Ace Attorney series that only wrapped up a couple of years ago, so it's much more modern compared to a lot of the things we've talked about so far. But this one's interesting. It ran for 3 seasons. It has some mixed reception. Some people criticizing the anime art style itself, or kind of departing from the manga, which also is an adaptation. I haven't actually seen this one personally, though it is available like on Crunchyroll, so hey, if you're a big Ace Attorney fan and you've wanted to see something expanded upon, here's an interesting one to look at as well. Okay, then there's a few bonus ones we'll mention real quick. Level 5 is a game studio and publisher that has done the Yokai Watch series along with the Inazuma 11 series, and those both had animes, but they're not really like Nintendo sanctioned animes. They're through the publisher Level 5 and then the studio that they partnered with, so it's not really a Nintendo game, even though they do have a close relationship with Nintendo. And of course there was that Donkey Kong 3D animated series that we don't talk about ever, seriously ever. But otherwise, that's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, maybe let me know in the comments down below. It's a little different from the stuff we normally do. We'll be back with the regular Animal Crossing related content shortly, but after that 100 days of Wild World, I wanted to do something a little bit different. Thanks so much for all the support though. We're incredibly close to 25,000 subscribers at the time of recording this, which is awesome. But otherwise, that's it for today. Make sure you subscribe and notifications on if you want to see more content, and we'll see you all next time with a brand new video.